So the question really was like, do these different body types suggest that these people lose weight differently? Okay, Johnny, go.
Bringing you a reasoned approach to health and fitness. This is the Phi Life Podcast.
Welcome to the Phi Life Podcast. I'm John Barbin. With me is Brad Petalon, and Brad has a topic for us today that he hasn't even told me about. So
it's going to be way more fun. Okay, so
right.
I was doing a presentation last week, and at the end of the presentation, someone asked me, is there a difference in how an endomorph versus an ectomorph versus a mesomorph loses weight? So don't answer. I'm going to explain what those things are while you kind of contemplate. Then you tell us what you think, and then I'll say what I thought. So ectomorph, mesomorph, and endomorph are kind of traditional ways of describing a human body. Ectomorph is typically thought of as a smaller bone structure. So if you're a taller, thinner person that we typically associate with less body fat. So you're just your typical sort of skinny person. A mesomorph is a broader, more robust set of bone structure. There's someone who you consider kind of being naturally well-muscled, just carrying sort of an average amount of body fat. That an endomorph would be traditionally thought of as someone with a very big bone structure. So if we measured everyone's heads, the endomorph would have a very large head, very large wrists, prone in this scenario to carrying more body fat. So your endomorph is your typical friend that you have who's probably carrying more fat than anybody else, but also has like big knees, big head, big wrists, just that big guy or girl you know. Mesomorph is that middle ground, and ectomorph is sort of your naturally skinny person that we all know who's also just slighter, right? Slighter wrists, slighter everything. So the question really was like, do these different body types suggest that these people lose weight differently? Okay, Johnny, go.
No.
Okay.
I think whenever you now, okay, sorry, caveat. Differently, they might experience it differently, but
right.
Biomechanically or physiologically, the mechanism of fat loss. Are we talking about fat loss here?
Let's do both. Let's cover both. Yeah.
Body weight and fat loss. Oh,
yes.
Okay. The mechanism of fat loss is the same. It can't.
Agreed. Yeah.
It can't not be, because they're all human beings, and there's only
True.
one way the body will liberate fat and remove fat from fat stores. So that'll always be the same. But as far as total weight loss, endomorphs probably can fluctuate bigger because they're carrying more lean mass. They're probably carrying more body water content.
Yep.
I'm already thinking of somebody we know who was really muscular, really big, college football lineman, and he could easily go up and down 20 pounds within a week or two of starting a diet. And there was just so much more mass, not only fat mass, but muscle mass, that his fluctuations were much larger. Mm-hmm. Whereas if a ectomorph started a diet, not a lot's going to change because they're not carrying a lot of extra mass in either the lean or extra. They're not carrying that as much mass in the lean or fat compartment for the fluctuations.
Or just total, right?
Yeah, they're just not as big, so not as much is going to happen when they start dieting. So the endomorph, being the larger person, can have bigger swings more rapidly. Mm-hmm. But on the standpoint of how mechanistically they lose fat, it's all the same. But to the other person watching it happen, the endomorph's going to move way faster.
So that
both
was my
directions, and they're going to gain lean mass faster too. Yeah. So when they start working out for muscle mass, their strength and lean mass is going to shoot up faster too.
Yeah. So my suggestion was that the experience is radically different. So for an endomorph, that first week of a diet, they may see 5, 7, 8 pounds of weight loss, and that's extremely encouraging. Right? Like you're in the right direction. Now, the sad thing there is after the third or fourth week, when they drop back down to 2 pounds, all of a sudden it's like, well, it's not working anymore. Right? So an endomorph will typically get this rush off the first week or two of dieting. And for them, the visual might not be as drastic, but the scale is so different, they feel like they're really accomplishing something. Whereas an ectomorph, in that first week, you're not carrying the same amount of body weight, the same amount of body water. You may be losing half pound to a pound, and you might think this doesn't work. Not working for me. All these other people online who are talking about this diet makes you lose 7 pounds in the first week, and I lost 1. This diet doesn't work. And so the experience is different. You're actually losing probably the same percentage body fat as the endomorph, but the experience is absolutely different. And then the other point you brought up was an endomorph. Because they have that just an extra mass, I feel that they can handle a larger calorie deficit. So they can go a bit more extreme those first couple of weeks and not feel the same effect. They can lose weight. They can even lose more muscle mass than the ectomorph, but they've got lots to lose, right? And they could lose a ton of mass and still end up with way more muscle mass than the average person. Whereas an ectomorph, if they go too hard too quickly in the very beginning, not only do they not see the weight loss on the scale, they feel like hell, right? They feel lethargic and tired. And then if they keep that up, they may lose just a bit more muscle than an endomorph because they have less body fat to fuel the system, which then may affect what they're seeing in the mirror in such a way that an ectomorph who diets like an endomorph, in my opinion, will hit a spot where it's either not working for them in their mind or they don't like what they're seeing. An endomorph will lose weight very, very quickly, and then it'll start evening out, and they're the people who will be like, it stopped working for me. So even though, to your point, the mechanism is exactly the same, we feel there should be sort of more personalized approaches, but the experience is radically different.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that when you said, oh, well, I heard online this, or I read about it, or there's even a research paper or a book written about a particular diet system and the expected weight loss, the speed of the weight loss, even how the weight loss feels. Well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about endomorph, ectomorph, mesomorph? I don't even think that's a distinction ever considered in research at all. Which
I
seems...
find it funny on Instagram or Facebook, places that when people mention their weight, their body weight, and how much they lost, the immediate next question someone asks isn't like, well, how tall are you? Right? So there'll be some guy online being like, I lost 17 pounds in a month on this diet. And then I'll get these women coming in being like, oh, I've only lost 3 or 4. And then I'll have a private conversation with the guy and he's like, yeah, I'm 6'5". And you're like, well, these women are 5'2", 5'3", trying to compare numbers, right? So it's not just endomorph, ectomorph, it's also height. It's just how much mass do you have to lose?
Oh yeah. So take a tall endomorph versus a shorter, I don't know, mesomorph, and you're going to be wildly different.
Yeah.
Wildly different in how much total weight you could lose in a given time frame.
Yes.
Now, with that said, ectomorphs aren't usually looking to lose weight in the first place. So
no, but they get that skinny fat thing where they're trying to change their body composition. But for a lot of them, that just means diet. They should be working out.
Right. And on that note, the weight gain comes slower for an ectomorph too. I think just everything's slower for an ectomorph. There's less to work with.
Less drastic though, which is good, right? But yeah.
They're in a tighter constraint, like on both sides.
Yeah.
So their fluctuation is going to be smaller. I think the time frame for all of it's going to be longer too. So to gain mass is going to be longer. To lose an appreciable amount of body mass is also going to be longer. Whereas an endomorph, all of that happens faster on both sides.
Yeah. So I would say if I were to personalize diets for people, which we do on occasion, I obviously take into account ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph. When you and I are working with people, not only do we get height, weight, and measurements, we'll look at the circumference of their head or their wrist to kind of get a feel on top of the pictures what we're dealing with. For an ectomorph, I typically do a less drastic calorie cut and a larger focus on the protein intake and the weight training. For a true endomorph, when you're just like, oh, you probably fast for a week, right? And be fine. You'd feel fine and you'd see result. I don't make them fast for a week, but you know what I mean? They can take a more drastic approach. But if you're coaching them psychologically, you have to prepare them. Like, look, at your first couple of weeks, you're going to see some drastic weight loss. By week 3, 4, 5, you're going to come right back down to the pound or 2 per week, right? So it's not that it's not working anymore. It's different. And preparing both those sides of types of people for the results they're going to see helps encourage them along the way. But they both hit a hiccup, right? Because the endomorph, it works drastically for the first couple of weeks, and then then it gets tiring and the weight loss doesn't happen as quickly. And for the ectomorph, it doesn't happen at all in the first couple of weeks in their eyes, right? Because a half pound to a pound fluctuation in weight can just be hidden by water weight changes. So they're just like, this diet doesn't work for me. And in both groups kind of need to make it to about week 4 or 5 before they actually can judge where they're going or what's happening.
Yeah. And these are loose categories. They don't have hard cutoffs. There's no real exact definition of where someone is. There's a few people in any given population that are quite obviously on either end of the spectrum, like a proper true ectomorph and a true endomorph. And then everybody else is a sliding scale somewhere in the middle. So I think most people think they're probably in the middle. Most people, I mean, unless it's super obvious, like we have a buddy who's 6'5" and 270 pounds. Like he's a true
not
endomorph.
a natural ectomorph. Yeah.
No, he's an endomorph. He's just big. He's just big, right? So, and can fluctuate very easily, can go way, way up from there. And we have another true endomorph who's only 5'11" and has made it all the way up to 300 pounds, but immensely powerful, tons of muscle. So those are, but I think you kind of know, like it's kind of obvious when you're on the extreme end. And then the extreme ectomorph, whose body weight's never changed more than 2 or 3 pounds, but no matter all the weight training in the world, they could barely add a few pounds of muscle. The extremes are rare. The rest of us are on a spectrum. So when we call it endo, meso, ecto, it's not, almost everyone's somewhere in the mesomorph category on one, somewhere in there.
It's a scale. It's a range.
It's a scale.
Right?
And so from that standpoint, you could say that the results from research approximate people in the middle, and your outliers, your ecto and endomorphs, are gonna push those numbers around a bit, but most people would relate to the average number there versus if you're on the extreme. But you kind of know. I would think you would know you're on the extreme if you are.
Yeah, I think that an easy way, because the problem with gaining body fat is that you kind of start looking like an endomorph, right? Even though you might not be an endomorph. So I do go by circumference of just the big joints, the big knees, that sort of thing. And the wrist measurement on a guy, if your wrist is somewhere between 6 and 7 inches, depending on your height, you're average. If your wrist is in that like 8.5, if you're one of those guys who's like needs extensions on your watch strap, you're an endomorph, right? Like it's everything is the bone structure, everything is bigger. But at the same point, if your wrist is well under 6 inches, again, to your point, you kind of know just by looking at it, but your body tends to not be set up to carry large amounts of weight in the scaffolding of it all, right? So that tends to make a quick visual on, okay, you're not actually an endomorph, you're just overweight, or you're a big human who's designed or structured in such a way that you can carry a lot of mass. That tends to be sort of a giveaway for me on how to approach things.
Yeah, and I can think of a buddy we have who thinks he's an endomorph, just thinks he's a big guy. Yeah. And he works out a lot. He's I guess you could say he was in good shape for his size, but he was just carrying a lot of fat mass that he just carried it kind of well, I guess. Mm-hmm. Like aesthetically, it didn't look as like he was carrying as much as he really was, but he was not a true endomorph. Compared to in that same group of friends, we had a true endomorph who was, his calves were like 20 inches around. Like he was truly an enormous, massive wrists, super powerful, enormous shoulders. Now this other guy, when he stood next to him, sort of kind of, you would almost put him in that category. And then you realize, oh, he's actually smaller than him. He's just carrying way more fat.
And it's shirt off, you can tell the difference too.
And with his shirt off, you can, this is, if we did a body composite, like a DEXA on these two, the true endomorph would have tons of muscle mass. Yeah, he'd have fat mass there too, but it was truly like a bigger, heavier skeleton, like literally a larger skeleton. The whole big bone thing, it's like a real thing. But then our other buddy who's sort of in a shirt, sort of looks similar, you'd realize, oh, your skeleton's smaller, your wrists are smaller, you don't have as much muscle mass. Oh, you're just carrying more fat, but you just carry it in a way that almost suggests you're on the bigger end of the spectrum. And and that guy specifically always thought he was only like 15 pounds away from being in really, really good shape. When you and I both know he had about 60, he had like 60 to lose. Yeah. To be like, to have a visible 6-pack abs and have the sort of beach body he thought he was 10, 15 pounds away from.
Yeah.
And which means at 5'10", he would have gone from 230 down to like 165. And that's his true.
He was never going to do that. Yeah.
He was essentially Brad's size, Brad's category, kind of average size, but he was just carrying so much fat. He thought he was a bigger type, but he
let me
never
know all the time too.
And
right?
he never was. He just carried it, and it was, you know, he'd pinch a little bit. He's like, oh man, just 10 pounds. I'm like, oh Jesus, no, you've got so far to go. I mean, it's fine. He was fit. He had tons of cardiovascular endurance, and he was strong and all that stuff. I'm not making a comment on the health of his body per se, but his perception of how far he was from visible defined muscles was so far from where he really was, and he just couldn't. He could never put it together. He was that far away. He just imagined he was just a big guy, and I'm like, no, you're really not.
No. I will say though on this topic that, and this is actually very true for women too, is the end goal of an ectomorph, mesomorph, or endomorph is that when an endomorph person tries to get to ectomorph levels of body shape, it doesn't look right. Like you're just meant to, if you think about it, you're lucky, because if you take the scale weight away from it, you're one of those people who looks best with a bit of muscle on you, right? You're a bit of a bigger person, but you pull off that sort of bit of a bigger look better, right? Whereas an ectomorph does always have to be ectomorphous to pull off a very aesthetic look. So, but the mistake is when an to our point of our friend, when an ectomorph tries to emulate what looks good in an endomorph, it doesn't really work. And vice versa. So I would say, from a bodybuilding, just looking at the pictures behind you, right? Frank Zane never tried to look like Ronnie Coleman. It wouldn't work,
and he couldn't.
And he couldn't, right? It
no matter how hard he. Well, I think I have Zane here somewhere. He's probably. I don't think he's in this. Oh, there he is.
Oh, there he is. Right there. Boom.
So Zane. So Frank Zane right there, and Schwarzenegger right there.
Zane spots. Yeah.
They both won the Mr. Olympia. Schwarzenegger's pure muscle mass versus height is percentage-wise way bigger than Zane's. If Zane tried to build himself to that, even with as much drugs as he could take, it just wouldn't ever look right. But he looked amazing for his size. It's a perfect example. Whereas Schwarzenegger, if Schwarzenegger tried to
get down, well,
if he tried to get as lean as Zane, he would actually look a little off. Something would look sort of. You would look at that going, he's doing something wrong. He needs to be bigger. Even an untrained eye would recognize that. He just needs to be bigger for it to look right on his physique. Yeah. Whereas if Zane tried to get that big, he would look off. So that's a perfect example of Zane is an ecto, just a very, very lean guy who's just never going to build enormous muscles. And Schwarzenegger is a meso, just kind of right in the middle. And that's the muscle mass that would look, again, to win the Olympia, he has to carry more muscle than Zane on his frame.
And then from a women's point of view, we can talk kind of Olympic sports. You know,
there's Rachel McLish. She's right here.
McLish. I just don't know if everyone would know who that is. Yeah.
Well, she's the original, and up there, she's the original best Miss Olympia. She's what I would call today just a bikini model body. Now, all the weight training in the world, she's just not going to get much bigger than this look. But it looked perfect on her body. There are others. You can't see it. It's off camera here. But there are others like Corey Everson who could carry more muscle mass.
Right.
And it looked okay. And she won the Olympia bigger than Rachel. Yeah. But it was appropriate on her body because she started with a bit more muscle mass. McLish, if she tried to build herself all the way up to the size that Everson gets,
it wouldn't look right.
It's not going to look right. The untrained eye that's not an Olympia judge, you'd be like, it kind of looks bulky. Yeah. But on Everson's body, it doesn't quite look bulky. On McLish's body, it would, and vice versa. If Everson tried to get to McLish's size, she'd look a little thin, like almost too drawn. Like she needs a bit more muscle to balance.
Yeah. In Olympics, you have women who are pole vaulters, so just exceptionally powerful, springy women who are typically a leaner, lighter, narrower woman. Typically, right? Very aesthetically pleasing. Then you have women on rugby teams who are still, very aesthetically pleasing, but just they're starting with a much bigger frame. And if they tried to flip spots, it's not going to work. So you do have to know where you're starting from, what you've got as a mold in terms of what you're trying to build or lose to, and then you also have to adjust the diet to and weight training approach to match that. I think it's really important. So it ended up being a really good question and a good discussion, which at first I was like, no, mechanically it's the exact same thing. And I'm like, oh no, from an experience point of view, it's very different. And I thought, oh, from an end goal, it can be different as well.
100%. Yeah. So the takeaway here is if you can be honest with yourself where you are on that spectrum. And again, most people are somewhere in the middle. Yep. But even with that, as average as me and Brad are as far as our body size is, if I try to get to Brad's exact condition, or I won't quite look right.
Yeah,
we both just look a little different at the end, even though we're within a pound or two of being.
And I can't catch you in just the overall mass. It just
I'm always just slightly bigger than you, but you can always get slightly leaner than me. And it would just be that much harder for me to get to your leanness, and it would kill you to get just a couple more pounds bigger.
Yeah,
right. Nope. And it's just not worth the effort. So. And we're both kind of very average as far as where we're starting from. We're not on either ends of the spectrum. So I guess part of this is your goal and what's going to look best on your physique. If you care about this at all, which I'm assuming you do if you're here listening, what's going to look best on your physique is going to be related to your starting base material. And if you do already know you're on either end of the spectrum, as an ectomorph, meaning the very slight person who doesn't have a lot of body fat, but's not carrying a lot of muscle mass, your goal is not necessarily to really strip off fat, but it's to build just enough mass that looks good on your physique.
In the right places.
In the right places. And forget this concept, at least for guys, forget this concept of building, because if you're a Frank Zane type, that's your goal down there, not Schwarzenegger. You're just not going to have muscles this big. You got to be aiming for muscles like that. And if you're really, really big, like it's the reverse, right? So it's you're kind of trying to move, I guess in both cases, you're trying to move slightly to the center, but you're never going to jump the spectrum. And you just need to know that, like that's where you're starting. And it helps refine your goal, especially if you start off with a lot of muscle, you don't need to kill yourself trying to build more. Your really only goal is to strip off some body fat till you kind of like where you settle in at.
Yep.
And in the middle, you're not going to be extremely lean, but you're not also going to be extremely muscular. You kind of have what most people probably imagine is the standard average concept of build some muscle, strip some fat. So you're kind of doing both.
Yeah.
And you're going to settle in at what, 80% of the work, or 20, it's the 80-20 rule. Like you're going to get 80% of the way there. And then if you're trying to push it that much further, just settle into what's best for your size where you're starting.
Yeah, works for me.
All right. I think it's a good place to leave
fun
it.
One.
Yeah, that was a good one. All right. So for Brad Pilon, I'm John Barber, and that's your Phi Life Podcast.